Hi everyone. About a month ago, I uploaded a piano solo piece inspired by Joe Hisaishi's music, and I asked for suggestions on naming the piece. So I ended up choosing the title Onward, so thank you to the person who suggested it. I just finished orchestrating the piano version and I made a mock-up of the orchestration using all VSL libraries. So in this video, I want to discuss a little bit about the composition as well as the orchestration and mock-up. Let's start at the beginning of the piece. It starts with an introduction, and I was partly inspired by the Princess Mononoke score. I'm even using some of the same chords here. A D-flat chord ascending to E-flat, which eventually cadences to the tonic F. Here are the first three measures in the original piano piece. There's a really strong downbeat in the first measure with low D flats in octaves in the left hand, and a 16th note triplet right hand arpeggiated part that adds harmonic color to that D flat pedal, the major third, major seventh, and major sixth. When the left hand ascends to the E flat and B flat dyad in measure 2, the right hand plays the same texture with the same notes. When orchestrating this moment, the first thing I did was think about how this moment could be more orchestral and less pianistic. I actually made a 3-staff orchestral short score, which allowed me to expand the register and add more layers where necessary. You can see that in this moment, I'm adding a lot of sustaining chords using the same pitches from the right hand, but I've expanded the register up. I also added another triplet 16th note line with contrary motion to the original. But this is only still a sketch, and when it actually came time to orchestrate, I did change a few things. Let's look at the strings. I gave the violas the triplet 16th note line that begins on their low F and moves up and back down. I considered giving one of the violin sections the higher octave, moving in contrary motion to these violas, but then I decided that I didn't really want such a clean triplet rhythm happening where you can really hear every beat cleanly. I wanted a bit more blurring of these rhythms, so I've still given the first violins the triplet 16ths, but now they have a slightly different pattern and the overall texture is more blurred. Together, the first violins and violas span a wide range, and because of their slightly different rhythmic patterns, there is definitely a slight blurring of this texture, which is what I wanted. They're joined by second violins playing tremolos in divisi. I've given the cellos and basses those low sustaining notes, which actually places basses below their normal playable range, so they'd need to use the C extension to extend the low E string down to D flat in this case. By the way, disregard those random short notes throughout the MIDI view. Those are actually key switches that trigger different articulations for the VSL instruments. Putting the strings together, I actually have most of that original piano texture present here. I'll use the other sections, like winds and brass, to add additional colors and more density. I'm using Synchron Strings Pro here, and the agile legato patches for the first violins and violas are particularly useful. I'm using dynamics patches for cellos and basses, which adds a lot more realism into the sound. In the introduction, the brass section adds a lot of the sustaining power and harmonic support. This score is in concert pitch, by the way. Unison trumpets on that F, horns mostly above them, trombones below, and tuba on the low pedal notes. I gave the brass sustaining notes instead of giving them moving lines because brass, more so than winds or even strings, can provide that raw power in the background, while other sections can create motion on top of that background sustain. You'll notice a slight discrepancy in the trombone parts in the mockup. Instead of tied long notes across the measure, I had to break them into 2 chords because of the articulation I used. These are Synchron brass samples, and I really liked the diminuendo patch for this downbeat, but the note cuts off after about 4 seconds, so I needed them to re-enter again on a soft, sustained long note. But with everything else going on, you really don't notice the re-articulation. Moving on to the woodwinds, contrabassoon and bassoon 2 are doubling cellos and basses. First flute is providing a powerful high register F sustain, while most of the other winds are playing triplet 16th flourishes in various patterns. Like the first violins and violas, I wanted these flourishes to have a slightly blurred effect, hence the different patterns and contours. But I didn't want it to sound chaotic, so there's some repetition happening, and I'm sticking to just triplet 16ths, as opposed to layering different note value patterns. I try to have a balance between ascending and descending lines at any particular moment, as well as a balance between octaves. In the second measure, the overall dynamics are much softer, which allows me to use the lower flute timbre and have it actually be heard, which I think works well here. By the way, I'm using Synchron Woodwinds here. You may be wondering about measure 1, which is a rest for all the instruments. That's also partly inspired by the Princess Mononoke score. I decided to add a bass drum in measure 1, which has a roll decrescendo into the big fortissimo downbeat. There's also a tam-tam downbeat when the rest of the orchestra enters. These three measures repeat with some subtle variation, including a motivic idea heard in trumpets and horns, and then a resolution to the tonic F chord, where you'll hear the piano enter for the first time. Here's the introduction. So the next section of the piano piece was somewhat inspired by One Summer's Day from Spirited Away, particularly in the harmony and texture. Measure 8 begins the main theme, an 8-measure phrase in F major that features a descending left-hand downbeat bass layer, beginning with F, then moving to E, and then E flat and D before jumping down a fifth to G in measure 12, which begins the cadence at the end of the phrase. In measure 14, during the cadence, which repeats that D flat to E flat to F progression from the introduction, you also heard a brief motivic idea that was very much an homage to Hisaishi. When orchestrating these 8 measures, I wanted to use solo piano similarly to how Hisaishi used it on the foreground in One Summer's Day, which meant I needed to really thin out the accompaniment. I'm muting the strings and having them play long sustains in the background. I have harp playing some chords to provide additional color at the beginning of each measure, but otherwise the texture is very thin, which allows the thin piano texture to be heard clearly. I'll show the strings here in the MIDI as I play these 8 measures. You'll hear flutes, clarinets, and glockenspiel enter on that counter motivic idea in the last 2 measures of the phrase, at which point the upper strings switch to playing tremolos. I'm using the muted duality strings and the VSL Yamaha CFX for the piano. In the next 8 measures, I repeat the phrase, and I'm sticking to a very simple AABA structure because I found that it's very common in Hisaishi's music. It's not an exact repeat, however. Even in the original piano score, I added a denser accompaniment, and the cadence is a bit different. You can see in the last 2 measures of this phrase that I've brought back a texture from the introduction. For my orchestration of this moment, I chose to double the piano melody with Debussy first violins in octaves, at least for the first 4 measures of the phrase. The rest of the strings are sustaining harmony notes until the second half of the phrase, at which point the piano drops out and the string accompaniment becomes a bit more active, with cellos taking on the moving eighths from the left hand of the piano, and second violins and violas playing slightly more contrapuntal sustains above cellos and below the first violin melody. You can see here that I also bring back harp to take on some of that eighth note motion, which was lost when the piano dropped out. The brass is fairly thin during these 8 measures, with some background horns in the first half and low brass on sustains in the second half of the phrase. Likewise, woodwinds begin the phrase very thin, and they increase in density once the piano is gone, with oboes doubling the violin melody and flutes joining them a moment later. When the introductory cadential material returns, you can see that the clarinets have that triplet 16th note motion once again. Let's give these 8 measures a listen, and I'll show the strings once again in the MIDI. So that takes us to the B section of the piece. Here's the original piano score. I begin the phrase with a somewhat dissonant chord. It's a G-flat chord with a major third, a major seventh, and a sharp 4. A sort of ambiguous chord that immediately feels like we've modulated away from the tonic F. I then resolve that G-flat chord down to an F minor 7 chord, then repeat those 2 chords, G-flat to F. So then I take that basic pattern of 2 different chords and repeat it again, but I shift it up a minor third. So instead of a G-flat chord, it's an A major 7, sharp 4. This fragmentation and sequence is really useful for extending this ambiguous harmonic feeling in this B section, while also increasing the tension that leads us towards the climactic moment of the piece, which starts with a big A pedal in the left hand and a descending octave right hand line that starts on D sharp, which is of course the sharp 4 of A again. This chord moves by tritone to the E-flat chord, specifically an E-flat chord with a suspended 4th, then back to the A chord with the sharp 4, then back to the E-flat sus, but this time the E-flat chord resolves up to F major, the original tonic. I was really trying to create a sense of struggle in this B section, and to do that I emphasized this pushing and pulling of harmony, or a back and forth between dissonance and consonance. I also managed to work in a bit of the cadential motion for my introduction at the end here, with the rise from E flat to F. Here's how it sounds in piano. And here's the orchestration. I'll break this down by instrumental section, starting with woodwinds. The B section melody begins in flutes, oboes, and bassoons in octaves. Then 4 measures later, the oboes continue playing the melody, while flutes and clarinets now have trilled notes that provide some motion and tension. Then the entire wind section comes in for the climactic moment at the end of the phrase. The brass mostly continue in a supporting role throughout the B section. Horns begin the phrase with a syncopated harmonic and rhythmic texture underneath the woodwind melody. Then the brass builds with trombones and tuba, and then trumpets joining low brass during the climactic moment. The strings begin this B section with trills during the woodwind melody, and then when the woodwinds take on those trills, the strings take over the melody. Okay, putting everyone together, here's the B section. The piece ends with the return of the A theme material, this time played in first violins and English horn solo. The final cadence repeats that introductory material with 16th note triplets in strings and woodwinds, and a more powerful brass background. The piece ends with that D flat to E flat, resolving to F cadential progression. Here's the final phrase in the piano. So before I play the entire orchestration, I'll just say a few things about the mockup. This was done entirely with VSL sample libraries. They were all recorded on their Synchron stage. So Synchron Strings Pro, Synchron Woodwinds, Synchron Brass and Percussion, as well as the Synchron Harp, the Yamaha CFX, and of course the muted duality strings. For each instrument, I'm using the surround to stereo classic mix preset, and I'm adding a little bit of additional reverb from cinematic rooms, and some light EQing, but really not that much. For the piano solo, I'm using the concert-centered surround to stereo mix, because I'm treating this like a solo instrument and I want it positioned closer and center stage, as opposed to in the far back corner. For the actual mockup, I exported the MIDI from Dorico and then adjusted the MIDI to better fit the samples. I mostly just adjusted CC1 and CC11, so the only track that I performed in using a controller was the solo piano part. Everything else was done directly from Dorico. Okay, so I'll play the entire orchestration, and as always, you can grab the MIDI file, music XML file, Dorico file, and the Cubase project file on my Patreon page. This piano piece was actually the Patreon orchestration exercise of the month for November, and I had a few people share their orchestrations for feedback, which is always a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy Onward for orchestra, inspired by the music of Joe Hisaishi.